And we are live. Hey, Mitch, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for making the time to do this today.
Are you kidding me? I'm loving it. Thank you, Meredith, for asking. This is a great platform. We were just talking about Substack before we went live, and this is going to be a great topic. So thanks for having me on.
Of course. Well, I want to, before we get into the conversation, I think most people who've heard of Section 230 maybe have no idea where it comes from. And I think it's worth setting that up because the origin really explains everything about how the law is built. So before you take us into the Prodigy case, what was the internet even like in 1995? And why is a lawsuit from that era still governing what we see on our phone today?
Let me start with you're talking to the right guy because I was around back then. I was practicing law before the internet came around. I've always kind of been a tech guy, Meredith. So as soon as we started hearing about this thing called dial-up modems and laptops and things like this, the internet, I was all in. And the internet back then was something that few people were using, right? Before the 1995 ruling, which brought us this code section, few people were using it. I think we threw up our first website around 1994, 1995, and really looked at it as a static billboard. It was a site that allowed people to go to and learn about our law firm. If they wanted to click and email us or click and get a phone number, they could do that. And that's the important distinction between how things were back then and the way they are today. So back in the day, we were all trying to kick the tires and figure this thing out, right? But I will tell you, Meredith, one of the things that attracted my attention too, and by the way, everyone that's joining us, this is awesome, both live and recorded. I'm so glad that we've got both of our communities together. And I want to tell everybody right now, if you're watching this live or recorded, follow and connect with Meredith on Substack. She's got some great stuff that she's working on. Meredith, you have to tell me about your background real quick with reporting from the boardroom. And then I saw something else that grabbed my attention that most people aren't doing. You have a really crazy experience and background.
Well, I would love to talk to you about that, but I think most people are tuning in to hear you talk about Section 230. So let's
All right,
cover
all right,
that
all
a
right.
little
All right.
bit more too. I
So
don't want us
follow,
to get
follow
too
Meredith.
out, but thank you.
No, no, but yeah, no, because that's why I'm so glad we connected. So back around 1995 and before, it was basically the Wild West. And what a lot of people don't realize is they may have heard of Section 230 of the US Code, but what that all came from was something we're all familiar with. And if you've seen the movie Wolf of Wall Street, right?
Yep.
It's a story, about Jordan Belfort and his company Stratton Oakmont. And Leonardo DiCaprio played the lead role in the show. It's just a crazy story of a firm in Wall Street that was doing some really crazy things. And what happened is somebody jumped on a platform called Prodigy, which was a platform well known back in the day, dial up platform.
Right.
And an anonymous user made some allegations against the company that they were basically committing fraud. And fun fact, about a year later, I believe that's what the company either pled guilty to or
I was
was
going to
found
say
guilty
it wasn't a
of.
false allegation, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. But this is what so what happened is Stratton Oakmont filed a lawsuit against Prodigy, I think that's what it's called, Prodigy, and asserted that they were violating the law and they were allowing people to commit and state fraudulent statements on their platform. And to make a very long story short, the regulators got involved, Congress got involved, and people started realizing, okay, there needs to be some type of law protecting platforms like Prodigy back then, like Yahoo, like Google, whatever the platform may be, from a certain type of lawsuit. And that's where Section 230 uh, came along. And Section 230, Meredith, and I've got some of it up here on my screen. I think it's interesting. What Section 230 says specifically, and this is what everyone needs to pay attention to, it says, quote, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So it allowed these companies to do business open up their services without having to be worried about being sued. So that's where 230 came from. It came from the Wolf of Wall Street lawsuit. And fast forward, here we are today talking about it.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. And it's really interesting. So that threw up essentially a force field, even though a year later it was proved that what was posted was actually accurate. So, why do you think Congress chose to protect those platforms with this shield of immunity rather than punish them for not policing the content on the platform? Where do you think that decision came from?
It's a good question because I think there was a different mindset back then. I think everything that Congress does, what we're seeing today, is driven by money, by finance, by special interests, by power. That's what we're seeing today and why you and I write on Substack. But going back to the days of 1995 when 230 was enacted, those same dynamics came into play. But I think also what was happening is our elected representatives, people from the different internet companies, were trying to set up something where they could provide these internet services and not have to worry about being sued out of business. And back then, these services were static services. They were allowing people to post something or comment on something. They're providing. The analogy I make, Meredith, is they're providing the wiring in our homes. Think about it like this: back in the day, when an electrician wired your home, if after the job was done, you got into a fight with your spouse, or you got into a disagreement with your child, or something was said that was mean about a neighbor, whatever happened inside that home after the wiring wasn't the electrician's fault. Okay. It was the responsibility of the people living in that home to suffer and or deal with the consequences of what was said inside those walls of their home. It was a static relationship. The electricity wired and powered the home, but what happened inside the home was a separate interaction. Fast forward today, that's not what we're seeing with algorithms and AI. What we're seeing
Absolutely.
is that, yeah, it's an important point. What we're seeing today is that these companies and services, through artificial intelligence and specifically through algorithms driven by AI, are actually influencing and affecting and modifying, specifically with intent, the behavior of that same family in that same home.
Right.
And there have been some lawsuits that have come out of that where you've got somebody, a young girl looking at her screen on her phone at 2 in the morning. And it's not because she tapped and asked to see something, which is the way the websites were back in 1995 when this law
Absolutely.
was created. It's not because she asked to see something. TikTok specifically fed her something through the algorithm
Mhm.
to her For You page, which resulted in her then acting upon what TikTok sent her, which ultimately resulted in her tragic death. And it's one case that we look at as an example of the difference between how the internet was back in the day to how it is in today's world, where we're basically being manipulated, directed. Even if you're not aware of it, it's happening behind the scenes as to what we're doing. And so there's a new set of rules, a new set of activity, a new set of conduct that's taking place in today's world that many argue, including me, should result in some changes, some modifications to Section 230.
That's interesting. I want to come back to this algorithm. We also should remember that the iPhone wasn't out yet. You weren't walking around essentially with a billboard in your pocket. You had a flip phone if you were lucky. I mean, I'm not even sure BlackBerry if there was a PDA in 1995. But
Good point.
the problem today, as you rightly say, whatever problems that existed, the algorithms absolutely exacerbate it. We didn't anticipate that, nor did we anticipate the magnitude of the attention economy that grew up around them.
Mm.
Do you think 1996's law, in the absence of being built to handle this, it's time to revisit it?
I do. And I think that it can be revisited without eliminating 230. I think it can be revisited by modifying Section 230 as already has been done. For example, modifications have taken place that would criminalize certain sexual posts and content on social media. Section 230 has been modified to criminalize certain intellectual property violations, sex trafficking, and things like this. It's been modified over the years, which tells me that it can continue to be modified to take care of some of the new issues and challenges that we're having. Senator John Curtis of Utah and Mark Kelly of Arizona came up with the Algorithm Accountability Act. And what it tries to do is proposing that the platforms have to pay attention to what the algorithms are doing, are instructing behind the scenes, directly, indirectly, the users to do. And there needs to be some kind of due diligence, reasonable foreseeability factor in the end result. And I think it's a very reasonable bill that's being proposed, but it's not going to go anywhere with this particular Congress because this particular Congress is being motivated and controlled. And we're going to talk about this by, big money, big internet, and a lot of people with power and influence that don't want to see anything change.
No, absolutely. I actually want to push back as a reporter and on Section 230. I'd like to see it repealed. And the reason why I'd like to see it repealed is because in this day and age, it would be hard for me to argue that these media platforms are not just that, media platforms. They're called social media, and they say, hey, we're not responsible for the content. And yet, in the way things work practically, news dissemination is incredibly fragmented. And most people nowadays do turn to social media platforms for at least some of their news, some people for all of their news. And if you actually turn to these platforms and said, you know what, guys, you're going to have to moderate what's on your platform and make sure it's factual, I would say that a lot of the really awful stuff that's on these platforms would go away overnight. Because as somebody who's worked in a newsroom, it's bloody hard work. Fact checking is really hard work. And it is not fast. It can't be an algorithm because you sit around and this being an attorney, you have to really look at things carefully and debate what can go out and what's not and what's defensible. So I wonder if you have an opinion on my
Mhm.
on my radical opinion about it.
It's not radical at all. I mean, I'm a reasonable person. I totally get where you're coming from. The challenge with that and the pushback we're seeing is that if there is unequivocal, unlimited liability on the providers, for what's put on their platforms, even if it's done without their consent, with their knowledge, with their permission, contrary to the terms of service agreements. What people are afraid of, and I think it's a legitimate concern, is that legitimate, proper, maybe political content, controversial content, as to whether or not somebody walked on the moon or the Earth is flat or whatever it may be, benign content that may not be accurate, but people are interested in talking about it. What might happen is platforms might actually overregulate and prohibit the type of content that you and I are reading each and every day, just to avoid being in that gray area. And so it's not, a clear cut, we should do this or that. And that's why I wanted to bring up originally there are limitations that have been implemented into 230. Like I said, sex trafficking, copyright and trademark claims, federal crimes, and federal wiretap law violations have all been brought into Section 230. I think I listed in this morning's post that I shared on my Substack
Yeah.
4 suggestions that could be implemented, Meredith, into 230 that might help us move forward based upon modern algorithms and the modern approach to how most of us are using, social on these things. Like you said, they weren't around when when 230 was originally written. And the first thing is there's 4 things, everybody. We want to protection stays for plain hosting. If you're hosting a static type of content, like we talked about earlier, the way it used to be, and you're not manipulating or influencing anybody because of the algorithm, because of something other than the written word, the video, the audio presentation, there probably should be ongoing protection under 230 so that companies can do business. Totally get that. The second factor, and we can go back and talk about these, Meredith, is paid promotion loses the shield. If you're being paid to promote something and that something harms the user, that
That's a
that
good
that
point.
thing that's that thing that's being promoted that you're profiting off of reasonably can be seen. It's foreseeable that it's going to cause harm to the end user. Then there should be some type of liability scale associated with that. Knowingly amplifying something that's untrue, that's false, that's harmful, that's illegal should expose you as a platform to liability. And then the fourth element I talked about in more detail on my post this morning is product design. Product design online, digitally, in my opinion, should be subject to the same product liability and product design issues in the real world that we have right now when it comes to designing an automobile, designing a phone, designing, everything that we use each and every day. There's a well-established set of rules and regulations, both state and federal, when it comes to product liability. And once again, you can incorporate some of those existing tools into this four-step process to maybe pull back some of the protection or immunity that these companies are experiencing right now to move forward. But here's the problem: to do any of this stuff, to go the direction you want to go the direction I'm suggesting, it takes Congress. It takes the cooperation of people in the House and people in the Senate working together to modify these rules and regulations. We have a lot of money through Citizens United, through lobbyists coming into Congress, especially when you look at when Trump was uh, sworn into office. Remember everybody that was there that day on stage with him or in the audience? Every single big tech CEO
That you
or
want to hold
investor,
accountable was sitting at his inauguration.
they're right there, writing checks. And
Yeah.
so for all of this to change, we need independent Congress people to come in and effectuate this change. And that's one reason I think that the Algorithm Act I referenced earlier, is probably a good start. I think a lot of Congress people, a lot of senators could wrap their heads around that if it was ever put into place as a bill eventually for a vote after this year's midterm elections.
Okay, so here I am pushing back again. Everything you say I agree with, but a couple of things. One, yes, there are regulations in place and there have been upgrades to 230, as you rightly said. But it doesn't stop people like the Tate brothers. These things
Mm.
still go on on these platforms and can exist for years and do an enormous amount of harm without anybody being held accountable. The law is not real time. You know that better
Yeah.
than I do. It can take a long time for a case to be brought and move through the courts. If you look at the case that Meta is just settling now, it
Mhm.
took a long time to get there. There have been a lot of stabs to try and hold Meta accountable. And the fine, while it's great that it's happening, it's a line item essentially for Mark
Oh,
Zuckerberg and
absolutely.
Meta. And so the cost of doing
So
business
that's
is,
Meta and Google. It's Meta and
yeah,
Google, just for the
right.
for the viewers.
You're absolutely right, and forgive my omission.
No,
But
no,
when it is a line item, it's kind of like in the old days with the cigarette companies. I mean, nobody
very
thought
similar.
that smoking cigarettes was good for you, and yet it took 60 years or whatever of evidence before somebody said, "You know what? Maybe we need to enact some legislation." In the meantime, a lot of harm was done, a lot of profits were made, and the cost
Absolutely.
of doing business, I don't really see much of a difference between somebody getting lung cancer or somebody taking their own life because of something awful online. So
I'm with you.
you're
I'm
right
with you.
about Congress. You're right about Congress, and I think that comes back to how do we start getting some of this lobbyist money out of these decision makings. But do you see any sort of sea change? Is there something that's changing societally that could push us in the direction we need to go to make everything safer?
I do see that. And let's go back to smoking cigarettes just for a
Okay.
second. I remember during my high school athletic days, going in for our physical, and my family doctor would come in with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. Okay, giving me my physical. How you doing, Mitch? Feeling pretty good? You're good to go. And when I started practicing law, all the way back in 1986 is when I started. I'm in my 40th year and I still love it. You couldn't sue big tobacco if it if their product gave you cancer. Okay, I was around before you could successfully sue big tobacco. I remember the lawsuits. I remember the trial lawyers exchanging back then. I think it was DVDs or CD-ROMs with all of our pleadings and discovery. And the lawyers worked together to finally create change in the court system, which happened at the trial level with verdicts and with verdicts that held up on appeal that resulted in new laws being made both at the state level and the federal level. And so it took a long time. To your point, it took a long time, but change eventually happened. People started becoming more aware of the hazards of smoking and how it can cause lung cancer, not only for you, but for people around you who
Around you.
didn't
Yeah.
smoke, right? I think that made a big impact. So you're talking to somebody whose dad was one of the Winston cowboys on the Winston cigarette ads.
Are you
True story.
serious?
True story. Yeah. But
Oh
that's
my
another story for
goodness.
another. I know. I've got the pictures and everything. So, but having said that, what I'm seeing with social media, what I'm seeing with the things that we're talking about today is I do feel like the consumer, especially the younger consumer, are more aware of the hazards and dangers and the downside to this media than maybe my generation when it first came around. Okay. And that also includes the algorithms and AI and things like this. In other words, they're doubling down on analog phones without an internet connection. All they can do is just text and call each other. They're not spending a lot of time on some of these different platforms. Now, don't get me wrong, most people are doubling down on these platforms and building their businesses and creating new relationships. And I get all that. But to answer your question, I do see a new mindset. And with that new mindset, I think there will come change. And so the question is, what's the right balance to letting a company provide you and me with a platform? Let's just take Substack, for example. I want to be able to continue publishing on Substack. I want them to be in business right now. That's just me personally. They're not perfect. They let a lot of people on whose content I don't agree with. Totally get
That's
that.
silly. Yeah.
But we have First Amendment rights and we've got different issues involved, right? Other than just 230. And so with all of that in mind, I want these platforms to be available so that we can continue to communicate, we can continue to inform, we can continue to share information with other people locally, nationally, and globally. But I also feel like there needs to be a new set of updated rules and regulations under 230 or whatever you want to call it that really does take the consumer's best interests and places it at the same level as these large corporations that are making record profits. So I don't have the answer to any of that, but I would like to see that happen. So I'm sympathetic and understanding as to where you're coming from. But without these platforms right now, you and I would not have met and we wouldn't be having this show.
No, and I don't disagree with that, and I don't think the platforms need to close down. I want to just quickly focus on the First Amendment because you touched on it. I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding of the First Amendment is that our founders really thought that freedom of the press, the media in particular, was a serious check and balance. And without it, you don't have democracy. And I think if you talk to people who are really experienced in the media, old veterans, and I've got a podcast coming out next week with John Williams, who was managing editor at ABC News and then BBC News, and he rebuilt RT in Ireland. He's about as veteran a journalist as I know. And he says this, and he says it's one of the wonderful exports that America has given the world in terms of
Mhm.
freedom of the press and really being foundational to a democracy. these platforms can be wonderful. As you said, you and I met. I read your stuff all the time. It's super informative. I learn a lot from it. There are a lot of fantastic writers on the platform. But misinformation is antithetical to a functioning democracy.
Yeah.
So rather than eradicate it, I think it needs to be policed for I'm worried about using that word, but it needs more than moderation. Is there a way to do that without making people overly liable, as you said, to the point where, they're at risk constantly being sued? Because I do think that when people cite freedom of the press, I don't think it's or freedom of speech, I don't think it gives anybody a right to essentially be a bad actor or to be a stenographer for a bad actor. Like, I think that there's an implication there that it should be factual to the best of your ability. And I don't think that's what we're seeing right now.
Unless it's comedy or sarcasm or a fantasy
Candy
piece,
yeah.
right? And we're on the same page, but as you well know, it comes down to how do we manage all of this and how do we make sure that what we're doing is the right and ethical thing to do? And I'm with you. The First Amendment, maybe indirectly looking back, it wasn't the reason I became a lawyer. I became a lawyer to take on the bad guys. And I always wanted to be a trial lawyer. There's a whole nother show relating to that. But fast forward to today, that's why you see me doing what I'm doing, because I'm interested in asserting my First Amendment rights to share my objective, good faith thoughts on breaking political news stories so that I can educate and inform the consumer. That's what I want to do. Now,
Right.
last night when I was laying in bed, trying to fall asleep, I was scrolling on a platform watching comedians on stage. And what they were talking about, moon landings, flat earth, things that had nothing to do with facts or reality. I was enjoying the comedy that I was hearing from these comedians. So I think we can both agree that's probably okay, right? To talk
Yeah.
about on these platforms.
Because I
Eh,
don't think there's a moment where you didn't realize that it was satire or comedy, like,
well,
or
well,
it was there.
so what I'm getting at is like those are two examples where we can both agree on, hey, totally cool. Everyone should be able to watch that content or create that content if they want to. But then you get into the gray areas. And it's like, who draws the line on those gray areas? Let me take a step back because I don't think we're ever going to have an answer to that question. I mean, how do you regulate that and decide what's
That
appropriate
is soul
content?
destroying to me that you don't
Well,
think
but
we're
but hear
ever
me out for
gonna
a second, because
yeah,
hear me out because there might be a solution. And
okay.
and what I'm getting at is the courts have been struggling that. Our society has been struggling with that. What is pornography? You know it when you see it. What can or can't you say? If somebody intentionally says something false about, whether or not President Trump was taken off the plane in a food cart or walked out the back stairway into the other plane, what's true and what's not true. It depends on what content you're reading and digesting, right? You shouldn't have to be afraid to report either one of those versions of the story. They're both telling the same story. It's one's being presented by the New York Times, the other one's by the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, and you can rely reasonably upon that content. So you shouldn't be penalized, in a civil action or a criminal lawsuit for talking about these cases. But here's what I think is going to happen. What I think is going to happen is with artificial intelligence, with the algorithms, I think you and I are going to be able to probably within 2 years click a button on Substack. And that button is going to be personalized towards what you tell it to do and what I tell it to do so that it filters that type of content away from us or away from the communities that we're building based upon how we're training, directing, and instructing the algorithm to do what we want it to do. So right now, we can pick and choose our communities. We can put in keywords to avoid. When it comes to trolls, we can block and delete, which I do all the time. But I think what we're going to see is AI and algorithms actually helping us fix some of the problems that you just brought up. And so there we go. Now we've got AI and algorithms fixing some of the problems that I talked about were problems 15 minutes ago. So this is a very
I've
dynamic,
seen
quick.
them Yeah, you're asking them to fix the problems that they broke in the first place. And I just have a kind of visceral reaction about that. It's kind of like the pangram now on Substack that will scan and say whether or not your piece is human written. I'm not worried by that because my pieces are human written, but I resent it because the only reason that they're able to do what they do is they've been scraping the information that people like me and you have been writing for 25, 30 years on the internet. And I I sort of feel like at some point the wings have to be clipped a little bit more, and we can't keep going back to the people that create the problem to say, "Oh, okay, well, now you can offer a solution." So I'm
Mhm,
sure that's
mhm.
not what you mean. So explain to me
Well,
what you mean.
yeah, I think that, artificial intelligence, is going to cause a lot of problems in the world, but I think it's also going to, provide a lot of solutions when it's
Okay.
used a certain way, right? Whether it's in
I agree with
medicine,
that.
health, and I don't know what's good or bad. It's here,
No, health
all
and
right? When I
science are great. I agree.
Right, okay. And when I keynote at different lawyer events, I just got back from Rhode Island. I was the opening keynote there, and I was talking about to a room of about 800 lawyers and judges, combining human intelligence with artificial intelligence to deliver a better and faster and more accurate result for the client that saves them money and frankly saves the lawyer or law firm time. So you can improve the quality of your life. You can spend more time with your family. Instead of 20 hours on a brief, you can do it in 2 hours, have a better quality product. The client's happy because you didn't bill them for 20 hours. And there are all kinds of issues with that. Um, I, the train is here and it's left the station when it comes to artificial intelligence. And so the question is, how can we leverage that to fix some of the problems that we've already talked about? The challenge I have, Meredith, is the people that are being put into place right now to help us monitor, manage, and fix these problems. And I'm not going to use profanity on your show, but it's a S show
It's
right
our
now.
show. It's our
It
show.
it it's just out of control, and when you look at what Brendan Carr and the FCC are doing with respect to deregulating and, you pay X amount of dollars, and we're gonna let your late night talk show exist or not exist, and the people that are running these shows. John Mayer had a song, talking about, oh gosh, now I just brought it up and I should be able to close this thought. But those that control the news or the message are the ones that control what we're doing. And that's what's happening right now with Carr and the FCC is if we're relying upon news, okay, even if it's accurate news, the next question is what news are we watching and digesting and listening to? Okay. Because the earlier part of our conversation was what you're posting, what I'm posting, what our friends are posting. Why is it okay for someone in their kitchen to be posting a live video of a cooking recipe? The rules and regulations that protect that person are the same rules and regulations that protect Google and when it comes to Section 230. So we don't want to take the rights away from mom in the kitchen or dad in the kitchen baking a new recipe and sharing it on TikTok, because if we take that right and remedy away, same thing happens with Google. We got to be careful about that. But what we need to do is make sure the big boys and the big girls who are in charge of the rules and regulations of monitoring all this at the FCC are the right people in place doing the right thing. And I think what America doesn't realize right now is people are being put into place that are going to be that are already dictating what you're reading, what you're hearing on major news networks. What we're seeing each and every night on the evening news uh, generally isn't what polls are showing that average Americans care about when it comes to the price of goods, or when it comes to politics, when it comes to religion, whatever the issue may be. They're feeding us and conditioning us as to what they think is important so that we think that it's important. And that's not the case. And I think the big thing we're seeing right now along these lines is, to your point, let me ask you a question. Is it okay for the president of the United States to call Democrats communist? I
No.
mean, that's factually incorrect,
It's
especially when
factually
it's a bla
incorrect. I had this conversation with John because I reported a story last year when that awful bill passed. and I did an assessment on the impact on healthcare cuts. And as part of my reporting, I called local legislators. I live in Virginia. I called local legislators, both Democrat and Republican. And the Republican legislators I called said there will be no changes to local hospitals, rural health care, Medicaid,
Oh, you're talking about
which
the
was,
big bill?
yeah. And it was so factually inaccurate. I
Right.
didn't put the quotes in my story. And my editor and I came to blows about it, as writers and editors do. And he said, "You got to put it in there, Meredith." And I said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not a stenographer for a bad actor. I cannot put it
Mm.
in." I asked John Williams the other day when I was interviewing him, "What would you have done if you were my editor?" He said, Meredith, I probably would have made you include it, but I would have insisted that you explain that it was a lie." And anyway, it got us to talking. I will tell you, I grew up in the CBS newsroom in New York. My father was a local anchor for WCBS in New York. And when I was growing up, as I'm sure when you were growing up, there were three main channels. And people
Right.
used to say to me all the time, "Oh, dear, we love your dad, but we don't watch CBS News because it's so liberal." And I guess,
Mm.
in those days, CBS was considered liberal. Okay. By today's standards, that's crazy. But my argument is when you went to a dinner party in, those days, you didn't arrive with a different set of facts. You all knew what happened that day, and you debated the validity of a certain action or a certain policy. You took
Mhm.
different sides about coverage of a conflict, but you didn't start out without the same facts. And I think that's what, when you talk about Brendan Carr and the FCC, and a lot's going on there, and I'd like you to talk about it, but, we've got a pay to play platform now where if the money is there and the support for this administration is there, it's the coin operated presidency. And Larry Ellison has managed to, they're taking over Warner Brothers and CBS and Paramount and, CNN. And when you have that and you have such obvious um, polarization with ownership of these networks, it is going to filter down to the information. That is not something I grew up with, and I don't think you did either. So how, that's not a Section 230 thing necessarily. What is that? And how can we fix it?
So, a couple of quick thoughts. Brendan Carr's approach to Section 230 is he actually wants to have the FCC punish companies for taking content down, okay? Treating removals of content as being the punishable uh, activity. So if you've got a lot of false information on these platforms, that these platforms in good faith start taking down under this new FCC, they could be punished for it. So that doesn't help the problem. It's going to make it worse. Back in the day when you and I were growing up, as you described, we were getting our news and then having conversations about it. And politics did come into it as to who was right or wrong. I remember back in the Vietnam War, sitting at my parents' kitchen table, a neighbor came over. Her son had just been killed in Vietnam, and all of us crying together and listening to the different takes on whether or not we should be in Vietnam. Okay, and we had conversations about it and protests about it, things like that. The reason I brought up the communist example is because we are seeing that this month.
Oh,
This is
yeah.
the latest talking point, right? And so, obviously, Republicans aren't communists, Democrats aren't communists. That's a whole nother conversation for another time. But when you have the 34-time convicted felon and adjudicated sexual uh, assailant sitting in the Oval Office using this terminology, and it's getting shared around the world in real time, 24/7. Should the platforms allow that to happen? Should they take it down? Should they not use the C word? communist when, reporting the news, or should they, like you said, have the reporter then follow up? There's no evidence to suggest that, the Democratic Party is communist just because they want to have streets to drive on, schools to send their kids to, and reasonably priced groceries when they go shopping in the evening after work. That doesn't make you a communist. And so it's one of these things where I think, circling back to fix all of this, independent journalism. What you and I are seeing on Substack right now is we're seeing a lot of people that had huge platforms on major networks that don't want to be there anymore. Some were asked to leave, some were fired, some decided on their own, this isn't for me anymore. I don't want anything to do with what's going on at this network. And they're building out these new avenues for us to digest the facts and the news and, frankly, to build relationships. And so maybe moving forward, instead of fixing all of these existing problems, maybe there'll be a new medium, a new way that most consumers will start digesting this information. Now, I don't know if that's the case, but I'll tell you right now, and we were
No,
talking about your son before we went live, but I know my kids, 26 and 31, they don't watch TV. Okay, they're digesting their content. They're watching the movies on streaming channels and everything else. They're actually pretty selective about how they're using their phones and their tablets, but they're not watching the evening news. And so maybe there's going to be a shift in society. Every time there's a problem, I think what we see is when there's a problem, that means there's a solution. Somebody needs to find the solution. A lot of my successful business clients that have started multiple companies, the ones that are successful are the ones that are solving a problem. You twice have told me, respectfully and politely, and I love the back and forth. Hey, Mitch, let me push back a little bit on that because you see a problem. Well, if we can use this technology and these new platforms to help fix that problem moving forward, and it's a long term fix, it's not next year, it's not going to be in 3 years, but over time, if I want to get information, I come to your platform on Substack. I listen to your interviews. I'm listening to your podcast because that is what I'm doing with all of our friends on Substack. Maybe that's the direction we need to go in order to effectuate change. That
yeah,
plus eliminating Citizens United, because
yeah.
that's
Well,
the foundation.
that's a
But that's the foundation to all of these problems right now.
all of it. Yeah, no, it's absolutely. I will say that in these two truths I hold at the same time. This is a golden age of journalism
Yeah.
because there are opportunities in so many different areas to do the news. But it has also never been more difficult to make a living as a journalist. I do not
Mm,
make a living
mm.
as a journalist. And I can tell you that for the average person on Substack who might prioritize paying for Tina Brown or Katie Couric or Jim Acosta because they're literally household names, they're not necessarily going to pay for my work. And I would argue that because, I mean, I've read Tina Brown, I would follow to the ends of the earth. I think she's wonderful. But Jim Acosta on Substack is very opinionated. And what I say to people is, I think he's a great reporter. I watched him on CNN. But make no mistake, all of us operating without a newsroom, without a legal department, without editors, without production managers and news managers, we are arguably opinion, and the burden is on us to be disciplined about the facts. And, that takes time. And if you've already been successful, you can afford to do that. You probably have a production team. I know that I spend hours and hours and hours fact checking the things but that's just my background and training. I don't want to put out opinion, but it is very,
Right.
very difficult. And so what happens is you're going to end up the people who are actually making a lot of money now, if you take away the really established old time journalists, are opinion people. If you look at the who has
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of followers on Substack and people who pay them, it's a lot of drivel. It's a lot of people who have, I mean, I'm sorry to say it, and maybe it'll offend some people, but it's just a lot of opinion or people who aggregate other people's news. So I think that, you get what you pay for, whether that's the quality of legal representation you have or the quality of the news that you're reading. One thing I will
Mm.
say for anybody listening to this is you're going to be missing us when we're gone because this is
Will they
how
though?
you
Will
make,
they?
yeah, they will. Because at
When you
the
talk,
end of the yeah, though at
no,
the end of
please
the
go ahead.
day, you make decisions about your life based on the quality of the information that's been given to you. And if you are digesting dross, then you're going to make some really rubbish decisions. And it has been proven in places where local newsrooms have been gutted, but in places where nonprofit has come in and local news has been revitalized, taxes are lower, civic engagement is higher, voter turnout is higher, there's less polarization in communities. This is all factual. So it may take you a little while to realize that you miss me when I'm gone, but you're going to miss me when I'm gone. Yeah, for sure.
So let me double down on a couple of things that you said. And when
Please.
it comes to dribble right now, the dribble that I'm seeing is coming from the White House press pool, and it's coming
I
from
would agree.
reporters on Air Force One that don't have the balls to ask the right questions or the right follow-up questions, or are totally comfortable apparently with
You're
this
right.
guy insulting their coworkers, their fellow
Well,
reporters and fellow journalists. And I've got friends that are in there. Okay. I've got friends that are there. You see them on television every single night. And for the life of me, and this is for them as it is as much for you and anybody else that's watching live or recorded, this is your moment in history to ask the damn question, to hold them accountable, to
you're
plan with your.
absolutely right.
This is the moment in history because right now, all you're doing is you're amplifying the misinformation that's coming out of this guy's mouth and out of the White House every single day. So let me first say that and then take a step back and talk a little bit about journalists making money
Well, wait,
because I
before
can,
you go on to the money angle,
please.
I want to wholeheartedly agree with you about that. And it's one of the things that John Williams and I spoke about. And
Okay.
I titled my episode Holding the Line. The courage is absent right now in newsrooms. And a courage, I've reported on war. I've been in combat zones before
That's what I
reporting
wanted to
Eastern
ask you
Congo.
about. Yeah.
Yeah, in Eastern Congo.
Yeah.
We can talk about that another time. But I will tell you that the courage to report the truth is every bit as important, if not more so, than the courage to stand in a war zone. And we are not seeing that. That is a failing. Also, John and I were talking about the correspondence dinner. I would get up and leave a room where my colleagues were being insulted like that. I wouldn't have
Unbelievable.
attended in the first place,
Right.
but I
Right.
would never stand in a press conference and allow somebody to call one of my
Right.
colleagues a fat pig, a useless reporter. The reason I love this job, despite the fact that it pays nothing, it is the best job in the whole world, is for the camaraderie and the collegiality of
Mhm.
it. And the fact that you can compete to scoop a story, but at the end of the day, you are one bunch in a newsroom. I could not agree with you more. So now over to you about the money. If you can solve
Yeah.
that problem,
So
Mitch, you're my hero. Yeah.
I maybe I can, but here's what I have to say about that is I also understand the dynamic of people wanting not to lose their job. They've got a mortgage, they've got a family they're helping take care of, and I understand the dynamics involved. I actually do think though there is a Woodward and Bernstein moment available to the right reporter or journalist who does the right thing to to make history. And whoever has the fortitude and the intelligence and the desire to do the right thing has a chance to really stand out in history. I think it's going to happen from what I'm hearing, but be that as it may, I get the dynamics. But yeah, I wouldn't have shown up at that dinner either. Are you kidding me? This is just, rubbing elbows, laughing, toasting each other. I saw friends of mine in there, doing things with people who, if I was in the same room, just so you know, I'd probably punch them in the face. I'm not recommending anybody hit anybody, but that's just me. I just am that upset about what's going on. As far as earning a living, okay, when I talk to lawyers, AI is completely uh, uh, changing the legal profession. And whether it's good or bad, we don't need to talk about that, but it's changing. It's changing everything. And what I don't want to see people doing is not appreciating that change and modifying their behavior and their activities and their plans to accommodate those changes because it's here. And so if things are happening for whatever reason that are beyond your control, and for me, being a lawyer, AI is going to be, replacing lawyers and reducing what we charge our clients. And to me, it opens up a lot of new opportunities. That's not what this show is all about. My thought process is, okay, if I was a journalist right now, what could I be doing that's not happening in the Oval Office or on Air Force One, like we talked about? Where can I be sharing the actual inside story, that interview that's not happening, that additional comment or story that nobody's reporting on right now? What platforms can I do this on? Who can I partner with to amplify that communication? Midas Touch does a great job of getting the right people with the right communities together to really focus on a particular point of view when it comes to the news. Whether you agree or disagree with them, that business model is working in the private sector, independent journalism, and I think we're just seeing it start. In other words,
Well, ProPublica is
Meredith,
fantastic.
I've got friends that I was around during the early days of social media, and I used to represent a bunch of social media influencers. I actually had a pretty good following and still do on most of the platforms. And I've watched people start $1 million companies with just this, with a business deal on the back of a napkin at a convention. 6 months later, amazing things are happening. And this was a business model that didn't exist when I was 21 or when I was 31, when I was 41. Okay. So with new technology and new social dynamics comes new opportunities. And the question is, who is going to be the and person? And we talked about this before we went live. I want to share and report on what's happening, and I want to build a community that feels the same way that I do. And I want to do it in a way that's cost effective. And I want to do it in a way where I can make a living, as opposed to, but it's too much work, but nobody's going to watch me, but I don't know which platform to be on, but it's going to take time and I'm never going to make any money. You can go down either path. And with all of the startups that I've helped over the years, 200 plus startups, every single successful startup I've helped and been involved with had three things going for it. The founders were the and people. They consistently on a daily basis, and let's move forward. And I told you, I watched an interview that reminded me of this just recently because it's so powerful. They also had good legal counsel and they had a good CPA. And with those three elements, they were able to build in a good product and service. And so what they did is they built these things out. So I would suggest whatever you're doing for a living, whether you're selling donuts on the corner donut shop, or you're a lawyer or a journalist, think about what can I do and how can I do this and this and this and this, and maybe do a deep dive using ChatGPT or Claude, something like that, one of your favorite AIs. Use the slash goal filter system. If you're not familiar with that, it really helps amplify what you're doing. Slash forward slash goal. And then you type in your prompt, your question, your problem, your challenge, and it lays it all out in a way that most people aren't really maximizing AI to do. And I think what you'll see, and see, I just said it, and I think what you'll find are some new alternatives, some new things you haven't thought of as to how you want to accomplish your goals. I know lawyers need to really double down and do the things that I just shared with you if they want to stay in business. But I think the same approach applies to journalists. It applies to doctors. It applies to accountants. It applies to anything. And this is just an interesting time where I don't want to come across on my Substack like I'm complaining about situations. What I'm trying to do is educate and inform so that we can have an
I think you and
informed,
I are on the same page
right?
there.
And
I'm
it's
feeling
like
the
a
same.
fine
Yeah.
line. Like sometimes I'll write something and I'll think to myself, wow, I don't want to come across like I'm complaining. Like, yeah, I'm pissed off, or yeah, this is BS. But what I want to do is I want the reader to feel empowered and to give themselves permission to have that conversation at the dinner table or with their next door neighbor or to register to vote and
We
then vote.
met
I want,
because we disagreed about something, and we kinda went
we did?
offline. Well, yeah,
Oh, okay.
it was
What do we,
something you posted on something being undercovered, and I was like, I don't know that it's undercovered," but
okay.
anyway, we
Yeah.
started talking about Section 230, and that's how we took that offline to a DM, and we decided
Yeah.
that we were gonna have a conversation. I hear everything you're saying. I think that the numbers in terms of journalism, there's a reason why you used to be able to have a career. It's expensive to produce journalism. What need investigations are expensive. I'm in the middle of a 4-month investigation on rural broadband, and the only reason that I can do that story, which I will bring to my followers and readers here, it's really fascinating, um, is because I have a newsroom that backs me. And when I think about a lot of the stories that I've done over the years, how much I've benefited, and I'm so lucky. I mean, I work with a
Yeah.
wonderful editor now who was editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning war reporter. And when I have questions and I'm working on a story, it's Paul that is going through line by line. It's a slightly different dynamic. I agree with your and. I'm an and girl, not a but girl. So I get that. But I want to get back on topic and I want to wrap up with you talking about what all these wonderful people who are giving us their time need to be thinking about as we head to the midterms and all the things that you've talked about and all the landmines that get in our way in terms of really understanding what's happening out there, what the truth is. And, I loved you had a post this morning about which I reposted with the headline that just said facts about nobody can stop you voting. I want
Mm,
you to talk
right.
to
Right.
all of us about what we need to be aware of as we head to possibly the most important midterm of my life, certainly
Yeah, I
my
agree.
voting
I
life.
agree.
Yeah,
This is it. This is the most important
this is
election
it.
I think you and I have experienced on top of the grass. Look, let's keep it simple. First of all, you don't need to try to figure out everything. All you need to do is register and vote. You need to talk to 3 or 4 family members or friends, register and vote. The elections are going to happen. And if you look at what Mark Elias talks about, and I follow Mark's work closely, there may or may not be uniformed individuals or ICE agents at some polling centers. If that's the case, it's going to be the exception. It gets complicated, but the challenge here has to do with the paperwork, not physically voting. And the way if you feel like I do, I guess Meredith, you want to change the majority in Congress, just think to yourself, all I need to do is vote and get my friends and family to vote too. That's what people need to understand. The dialogue out there, and it's in my article that I shared. It's actually a note I shared on my Substack, Meredith, that shared 2 prior articles I wrote. It talks about how Trump or any other president doesn't have the right to unilaterally cancel the elections. And it explains all the reasons why that's the case. And it talks about how we had elections during the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, each war thereafter, and each civil, dispute that took place. And what's happening is you're being distracted. They're trying to get you to focus on having that mindset where it just doesn't matter. There's nothing you can do. That's the goal here. And I think, Meredith, if people understand that their vote does matter, and as we've been doing in the courts, the lawyers and the judges have been holding serve in the courts. Trump's 0 in 21 when it comes to producing the voter rolls and things
So
like this.
important to
That's
say.
21 losses, people. That's a zero wins. I'm telling you, trust me when I say this. If you show up and vote, we can start to turn this ship around. Meredith, real quick, before you run on what can journalists do, you may have seen and or reach out to me afterwards about the 2 big blockbuster movies in Hollywood, because I'm just down the street from Hollywood, who were produced, directed, and acted in by a couple of YouTubers. Okay. And so over the last couple of months, everybody spending just 3, 5, 10, $15 million, There were a couple of movies out. I think one was called Back. What was it called? Back Room, and I can't think of the other name. But these were movies that were produced in a way that have never been produced and directed before on a budget that's just unimaginable. That broke block uh, movie was ticket office records, and so there's a way to pivot and keep practicing your art, doing your business, the profession in a way that people may not have thought of before, like these two separate individuals did. And it's probably the foundation to a long and lucrative career for each of these individuals. So I love to tell people, you know, think outside the box, take a deep breath, one day at a time, right? Don't do what everyone else in town is doing. If you're concerned about what's happening, don't simply repeat and repost what everyone else is posting. Okay. That's not how we fix problems. Think about what needs to be said. How do you feel about it and why? And research. Do your research. Make sure you know what you're talking about and then share your thoughts, whether it's in an audio or a video or a written post on Substack. And just be a leader. We need more good leaders in this country right now. We need more good leaders around the world right
I
now.
agree. We need more
And
good leaders. But right
it
now, I
starts.
feel like we have a lot of chiefs and not enough Indians. Everyone is is trying to be an expert in something that they're not necessarily an expert in. So my
Well,
advice to anybody listening is ask questions. It's okay to ask questions. One of
yeah,
the reasons I really wanted to have this conversation with you, and we talked about this before we went live, and it's a reason why I wanted to have a similar sort of conversation with Julian Zelizer a few weeks ago, is that we don't know everything. And it's really important to ask an expert every once in a while, hey, can you come on and ask these questions? And everybody who's listening, I'm happy to be the person that asks the questions so that you all can go to the dinner party and sound smart. I don't mind asking the questions. If people think, oh, that's a stupid question, fine. I'm happy to
yeah,
ask it. But I think at the end of the day, we are so inundated with information that we've kind of lost the art of asking questions. So everybody who's tuning in, you want to ask a question of me and Mitch. My job is as an investigative reporter. There is no question that I find silly or inconvenient. I am happy to research it, find out, talk to my pals who are experts. Mitch, same thing I would imagine for you, being a
absolutely.
lawyer and being vested into bringing facts. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Now is a great time to be asking them because we're inundated with so much opinion and a lot of dribble. I mean, that is definitely the case. I really would love to do this again with you and pick another topic because I think it's such a great conversation. It's such a privilege to have a conversation that I hope everybody finds informative. And well, we'll see. We'll see
Absolutely.
from the feedback. But I would love to do this again. It's been such fun talking to you, and
Be my
really, I've
pleasure.
learned a lot.
Well, and I have too. And to second what you just said, questions are the key to success. The more questions you ask, and ask open-ended questions. Don't ask questions where you're expecting someone to answer them a certain way. Genuinely care what the other person has to say. Ask questions from the heart. Lead with kindness and empathy when you're asking questions, and then stop talking and listen to the response. And then I do feel like right now we're all walking around with the answers on our phones using AI. I think if you use AI correctly, you can do a deep dive and get the correct answers, the objective, factually supported answers to your questions if you use it the right way. So maybe spend a couple of hours learning how to use AI the right way to ask the right questions, to fact check stories so that you are not miscommunicating what happened to your family and friends, and instead you are recentering what people need to be talking about so that we all can learn from what you have to say, from what you share on Substack and the other platforms. And maybe Meredith and I next time will have you on the show so that we can, all get through this together as a community because that's what this is all about. This is about being a community.
Yeah, no, so well said. I will just add for anyone, I do not use AI to write, but I use it as a research assistant. And I prompt it to fact check things for me. When I'm writing, I
Absolutely.
have thousands of pages of transcripts on this broadband piece I'm writing. I feed it in so that I can fact check myself against transcripts. And when I ask AI to help with research, I ask it to use primary resource material and to cite the source so that I can double check it. So AI is a tool that can help you do things faster and more comprehensively. It's not blind trust everything that an AI says, but if you
Don't do
prompt
that.
it correctly, I agree with you, Mitch. It can be a fantastic research tool, but you
Yeah.
just have to, like any other research or human researcher, you have to be willing to put in the work to make sure that what you're sourcing is factual. But anyway, I want to thank you. I know I've kept you longer
No,
than
I
I
enjoyed
said
this.
I
This is
would.
awesome. This was awesome. I
It's
appreciate it,
great.
Meredith. Thanks for having me on. And everybody, stay connected with Meredith on Substack. Connect with me over on my Uncensored Objection Substack. And we'll try not to let you
Absolutely.
down with the content that we share, right?
And let's do this again. If everybody
Love
wants
to.
us to do this again, give us a big thumbs up, tune in, leave some comments on the recorded version. And Mitch, it's so great to chat to you. Thank you so much for your time. This is really
It's my
fun.
pleasure. Thanks, Meredith.
Okay, everybody, thank you.